Hello, everybody. My name is Erin Canan, and I am the Dean for Civic Engagement at Bard College. I'm thrilled to be here today. I'm a big Eleanor Roosevelt fan, and never was there a more relevant time to be thinking about her legacy. Eleanor is a local to Bard College's Annandale campus in New York. She spent much of her childhood in Tivoli, which is a little village close to Bard, where many of our community members live. Last October, the community opened a little Eleanor Park with a bronze bust of her likeness as its centerpiece, and I need to reassure you that she's respecting social distancing and she is wearing a mask. Eleanor and FDR were both on Bard's board, and Eleanor wrote about the college's important role in the community in her My Day column, and later in her life, she was conferred an honorary degree. I am a fangirl of Eleanor. I debated on using this term, but if we can use it when we're talking about Andrew Cuomo, we can certainly use it when we're talking about Eleanor. I have been honored to sit on the Friends group to Valkill, which is Eleanor's home, about 20 minutes from Bard's campus in Hyde Park. And in a collaboration with the Valkill Partnership, which is the Friends group with the National Park Service, we have hosted dignitaries and scholars and students from over 20 countries through a variety of programs and projects. And I'm gonna let my moderator and friend, Manuela Roosevelt, talk a little bit more about that partnership in a moment. So why are we here? In January, Bard College and Central European University were announced as partners with the Open Society Foundation to launch a new global effort called the Open Society University Network, or OSUN, that integrates learning across geographic and demographic boundaries, promotes civic engagement on behalf of open societies, and expands access of underserved communities to higher education. This includes research, classes, coordination of academic degree granting programs, and different collaborations across the world. Some of these projects are in collaboration with universities, and some are in collaboration with cultural entities like Valkill and the Valkill Partnership. In addition, we're thrilled with the emerging partnership with the Talwar Network, which is an international association of institutions committed to strengthening the civic roles and social responsibilities of higher education institutions. And they have built a global movement of engaged universities. We're hosting a number of these talks that include important public figures, journalists, and also faculty and administrators from universities across the world to talk about the impact that this is having in our communities. There is also a student engagement award that we are piloting, and I will include in the chat access to the grant application for any students who are listening and want to apply. And it's to help students who are working in their own communities address the concerns of those communities and who have maybe moved some of their work in response to the pandemic. I'm going to turn the floor over now to Manuela Roosevelt, who's the chair of the Eleanor Roosevelt Valkill Partnership. It's a private nonprofit that works in tandem with the National Park Service for the enhancement of visitors' experience at the home of Eleanor Roosevelt. And I'm going to turn the floor over to her, and she will begin our program.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Erin, so much, and the team at Bard College. I want to welcome Peter Baker as well, and all the networks and all of you who are listening in today. Unfortunately, Susan Glasser was not able to participate, which means that she will be invited again, maybe with Peter again. They're absolutely extraordinary journalists, and she has a very, very important interview to conduct today at the same time. But Peter has promised that he will do double the talk. So we're looking forward to that. As Erin mentioned, I'm the chair of the board of the Eleanor Roosevelt Partnership. Eleanor's home is here in upstate New York. It's called Valkill, and it's preserved by the National Park Service. And we are a friends organization, and we do educational programs and also all kinds of other activities. And Peter Baker was our guest at the Presidential Library, appeared 2 years ago, and he fascinated the audience, and we want more of him. So the series of conferences that the network is hosting with us is called Tomorrow is Now. And that is the title of Eleanor Roosevelt's last book. She authored 30 books. I'm going to show you here. I don't know whether you can see it. It's a slim penguin paperback. It was republished in 2012. I recommend it highly for reading. And this edition has a foreword by President Bill Clinton and an introduction by Eleanor Roosevelt biographer Alida Black. So she wrote this book at the end of her life specifically for you all, for the younger generation, with more tomorrows ahead than in your lives than yesterday's. It is a call to action and a kind of manifesto for Americans and other citizens around the world to shape today the world that we want to live in tomorrow. She was dying when she wrote the book. She was 78, had written 30 books. Her nationally syndicated column, My Day, had appeared 6 days a week for 26 consecutive years. She had written more than 550 articles, so there was really no need for her to write another book, particularly when she was so ill. And yet she wanted to author this book. She wanted this to be her last words to the world, the last ideas and concepts that would inspire the next generation to bold action and strong commitment to shape society by getting involved and abandoning complacency. Her voice was so faint, she had high fevers and tremors, very persistent fatigue, and the lady who took her dictation could hardly hear her, but she produced this book that was then published posthumously, and that is very inspiring today still. And thank you, Peter, for participating in this first conference. Peter is one of the most accomplished journalists and authors in the world today. His intelligently researched and sober reporting keep millions of Americans and other international readers and viewers informed on a daily basis on the relationship between government and citizens. He's the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, and I must compliment you. The New York Times won 3 Pulitzer Prizes yesterday for reporting, and this is consistently one of the best newspapers in the world. We're here today at this extraordinary juncture when the world is on pause due to the COVID pandemic, and when everyone has been inspired to reflect deeply about the future and one's individual commitment to that future. So I want to take inspiration from Eleanor's Tomorrow's Now and ask Peter a few questions. Eleanor titled the second chapter in the book, America the Unready, and opened the chapter with a wry observation that after the American Civil War, which had made at long last a reality of the sentence, one nation, indivisible, an odd thing happened. The voice of the people as a whole began to be disregarded. Peter, is America one nation? Is it indivisible? And what has happened in your view to that promise? And what role does government have in keeping that promise? Does America remain unready to face challenges like this terrible pandemic?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, Manuela, thank you very much for inviting me to do this. And Aaron, thank you for including me in your program. I'm very excited to be here with you all today. Bard College is a fabulous academic institute, and I know that the participants in this will be producing a remarkable series of events for anybody who's logged in today. So thank you all for logging in today and joining this conversation. Boy, your question is really very, very timely, I think, Manuela. I think we are, in fact, not one nation, and we are divisible, not indivisible. And one of the things that's been very striking about this moment, this pandemic, has been to see a threat to all of us filtered through the lens of politics and partisanship. It's perhaps not unique, and perhaps not the first time this has happened, but it is rather striking to see things like whether you wear a mask or whether you believe there is a pandemic to begin with, depend on your ideological point of view or your partisan outlook. We've seen this now again and again through polls showing a rather stark disparity between Democrats and Republicans in their views of not just this moment in our history, but how they're responding to it and how they think the country should respond to it. Just over the weekend, they had a program online called One Call to Unite, I believe it was. And it would include Oprah Winfrey and Julia Roberts and a whole lot of celebrities, but they brought in President Bush, 43, President Clinton, a number of other, political people as well to give messages. And the message that President Bush, 43, posted, a 3-minute video, if you haven't seen it, I would recommend it. It's very effective. And he talks about us being one country, indivisible, as you say, and how we are all in this together. We are determined to rise together. And it was very, I thought, a reminder of what we have seen in the past from presidents in moments of crisis, whether it be Lincoln, FDR, or George W. Bush after 9/11. And the striking thing, of course, was not that he released that, but how immediately that was then perceived through a political lens itself. President Trump, the very next morning, tweeted out an attack on President Bush saying, well, where were you during the trial or what have you? So instantly a call to unite, a call to put down our partisan gloves became just one more fodder for division in this country. And so I think that's a real problem if you're a public health expert and you're somebody who's trying to look at this from a scientific point of view or a public policy point of view, what's the best approach here? And it's not an easy thing. There are plenty of arguments that fair enough on both sides, all sides. But if you're trying to find that rational, reasonable policy prescription, you are in fact right now torn between, these polarized factions and the tribalism that we're seeing in our country. And it's a very striking moment and a very important aspect to what we're going through right now that will last beyond the virus itself.
So this is important for this country, given its history of diversity that can play both ways, right? It can play to its strengths and can play also against its strengths. Internationally, do you think governments and nations have worked more closely together during the pandemic? Have the citizens worked and related more closely? And of course, we're awaiting for the results of international teams of scientists researching an effective vaccine. Is this is this a time to learn lessons for the future?
Well, I think the inspiring part of what we've seen in the last couple of months has been the bottom-up aspect of it, right? If you put aside our political leaders and you just look around communities in your neighborhoods, you look at what your neighbors are doing and your local leaders are doing, your religious figures, your college, your grocery stores, your restaurants, businesses around our communities, I think, have risen to this challenge and are not only trying to find the best way to fight the pandemic itself, but finding ways to keep our society going as best they can. The adaptability of the American people has always been one of the great inspirations, I think, and one of the things that Eleanor Roosevelt talked about, of course. And look at how much people are adapting. They're finding ways to create communities through things like this, through Zoom, through tributes to the frontline responders in the hospitals and I think that has been a remarkable sign of American resilience and spirit. Unfortunately, what you're not seeing is American leadership in the world, You ask about, are these countries working together? And I think there is some of that, but not as much as we have seen in the past. In the past, the United States was, in fact, the global leader at a moment of crisis like this. We would be setting the stage for bringing people together, bringing countries together, organizing joint and collaborative efforts. And while you do hear President Trump talk about the efforts he has made to help countries in need, and he has, and that's important, he is not a believer in multilateralism. He's not a fan of the United Nations, where Eleanor Roosevelt worked. And just yesterday, I think there was, in fact, a conference, a global conference of leaders to talk about this, and the United States chose not to participate. That's almost unheard of in the post-war era. And it reflects a deep distrust that has built up in the United States over these last decades in international organizations, in entanglements with other countries. The whole America First aspect or angle of President Trump's foreign policy has tapped into a well of resentment and distrust of internationalism. It's kind of a backlash to the relatively bipartisan policy that we had from Truman all the way up until Obama. And it manifests itself in a moment like this, I think, in a pretty striking way. So we were talking just over the weekend with a friend of ours who's a member of the European Parliament, and his wife, who live in Poland, and they were struck by how absent America really is from the scene. And the Europeans want to lead, and the Asians want to lead, and the Latin Americans and the Africans, all people around the world, have often said, well, America is too much putting itself out in front sometimes. There is a resentment against us in the outside world. But I think what we've seen time and time again is, if we don't lead, if the United States doesn't lead, there's a vacuum, and it's not filled by anybody. And the one place that is trying to fill it right now is China. So to the extent that President Trump has raised understandable questions about China's behavior in all this, China at the moment actually seems to be winning the international propaganda war by filling a space that we have left empty.
Right. Quite right. I think it is a profound change in America's international policy with the past, and I think that's an open question as to whether this change is effective in terms of world crisis like today. Another chapter in her book is titled "The Revolution in Education." In her opening paragraph, she stated, "Without a totally new approach to education, our young people are not going to be equipped to cope with the world of the future." Education has, of course, been transformed since the 60s when she was alive, and our talk today is hosted by a very large network of colleges with students from many countries listening in to you. More change seems to be needed. Peter, what do you think the education today to make a better future? You're a father, and also you report daily in a sea of news that bombard viewers and readers at lightning speed. What happens to news and the media with less education and the ability to discern between different types of information and reporting?
Well, that's a great question. And I don't know that it's specific even to the pandemic, but I think that the pandemic, of course, brings home these trends that we've been seeing. And we're in a vastly different environment than we were, of course, when Eleanor Roosevelt was alive in the early 60s. The access to information, access to different voices, the expansion of the marketplace of ideas is an extraordinary and wonderful thing for the world. Obviously, you can I have a 15-year-old son. I sit at dinner with him, and we have a disagreement over whether this is that or that happened on this date or whatever, and he looks it up and he knows within 3 seconds. Require a trip to the library or a deep research. That's true in the media as well. We are more democratized in a small d kind of way because we are more accessible now beyond our city borders. For instance, the New York Times now is read more around the world than ever before. Tens of millions of people read her every month. They have more access to us. We have more readers than we ever did. And we provide information in a new and more creative way. it's not just simply writing a story of 1,000 words and publishing it on a broadsheet piece of paper anymore. We create these very creative online vehicles to tell stories in new and different ways, through graphics, through audio, through visual. We do a lot of television ourselves. We do podcasts. We have Twitter and Instagram and all these other social media. So the democratization of information and the access to information is a startling and inspiring thing. And I think Eleanor Roosevelt would have been absolutely delighted to see it. The danger, of course, you alluded to this, Manuela, the danger, of course, is trying to sort through all of that and figure out what's real and what's not, what to believe and what not to. And this notion of fake news is actually a concept that we came up with before President Trump, sort of hijacked the term. And the term was used because we worried about things you might see on Facebook or online that were just made up out of whole cloth or distorted or what have you. And how do we help, as the media, how do we help people sort through it and figure out what's real and what's not? And I'll give you an example. For instance, I live just a few blocks away from a pizza place here in Washington, D.C. called Comet Pizza. And somebody online in 2016 said there was a child pedophile ring in this pizza joint run by Hillary Clinton and her chief aide, John Podesta. Now, obviously, this is nonsense. And 99% of the America would realize, probably looking at this, that's just nonsense. But we're a big country. It doesn't take very many people to believe it to create problem. And sure enough, a fella believed that, drove from North Carolina, burst into the pizza joint with a gun, and started threatening people, because he was looking to save the kids who he thought were being held there. So this disinformation stuff is dangerous, and it cause real life consequences. So what we, at the newspaper, what we try to do is help people sort through that. We now address mythology in a way we never used to, right? If there used to be a conspiracy theory that Bill Gates was responsible for the coronavirus, we would never have bothered to report about that or even mention that, because you don't want to give oxygen to something that's so ludicrous. Today, because you can't count on everybody knowing it's ludicrous, we wrote a front page story about how ludicrous this was, just to help people understand what's real and what's not. But as with many things, the good of this expansion of the marketplace of ideas also comes with some real challenges.
Right. So I think Eleanor Roosevelt knew that as an American citizen. She had one of the largest FBI files ever compiled on any American citizen, and she was accused of all kinds of things. And she felt very, very strongly that journalism and the media had a fundamental function in democracy. And she herself, through the My Day column, as I mentioned, she wrote 6 days a week for 26 years and had millions of followers, tried to bridge that gap between the reality of government and the hearsay of the effects of government policy and the truth, and to change public opinion, or to win public opinion on some topics. We may have several students in our audience who are studying journalism. Could you tell them why you're still excited to be a journalist and what it means to you today?
Well, that's a great question. And I think yesterday, the day before, just celebrated World Media Freedom Day or something like that. And I think that is a great thing to celebrate, because I hope there are some students on here who are thinking about journalism. It is an amazing path for your life. I still do it because I don't want to have to work for a living. I love the idea that somebody's going to pay me to do what I get to do. What I get to do is to talk to people, meet people, travel places, explore things, learn new things every day. My job is to go figure stuff out and to basically just learn about the world. And there can't be a better profession, in my view, than that. And I have my particular beat at the White House gives me a front row seat of history. But I covered the school board as well. I covered county supervisors and state legislators. I was a foreign correspondent. I mean, any journalism job just is enriching and adventuresome and enlightening in every way. I'm not saying that there aren't downsides to it. I mean, of course there are. There are editors, for instance. But other than that, it's mostly an extraordinary adventure. And I think that what we really need are some of you students we're thinking about it to get into the business, because we're going to need you. We desperately need your generation to come along, to provide us fresh ideas, to provide fresh legs, to help us rethink how journalism should be transformed for this new era, because we obviously can't stay static. We can't simply do things the way they've always been done. And I'm excited by that. I think all journalism is good as long as it follows basic values. The basic values of journalism being truth, fairness, accuracy, professionalism. Those sets of values, as long as they inform it, it doesn't matter to me whether it's video or, it could be a hologram, it could be whatever, anything creative you do to tell stories and give people information that they need or should know in their lives, that's journalism to me. So we need this next generation to come along, help us figure out how to transform it along those same values, but for a new and more creative era.
Yeah. Well, I think, thank you for that. And thank you for inspiring young students of journalism. I think that's one of the great legacies for making tomorrow now, yeah. to have very, very good reporting of the excellence and quality that you have dedicated your life and you continue to dedicate your days, even though you're having fun, but it's a very, very important I think aspect.
You're right. I should also, I talk about being fun, and it is fun because it's a remarkable opportunity. It is also a chance to do something that has a greater good, and I left that part out, and I shouldn't have, because when you get to learn something, you get to tell somebody else what you learn, right. And when you tell somebody else what you learn, you can help them make the world a better place. I think we should be careful about over romanticizing journalism as changing the world. Sometimes we get into that and we become a little jaundiced when we realize that we don't always change the world with our stories, but you do have an opportunity from time to time anyway to change things in a broad sense. Even just letting people see the world around them is a way of changing the world. And obviously there are those stories from time to time you write when you've actually changed a particular person's life or a family's life who's in trouble because you happen to write about them. That's very gratifying as well.
Right, that's right. In terms of changing the world, another chapter in Tomorrow's Now is titled Getting to Know You. Eleanor encouraged young people to be at home in the world, to learn and understand other people, and to be understood by them. With regard to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the application of human rights, she famously stated, "Where do human rights begin? They begin close to home, in places so small you may not be able to find them on a map." Peter, what happens when we fail to understand a point of view from which we are observed, and in turn from which we observe others? This failure has a compounding effect on the application and observance of human rights everywhere in the world. So again, understanding and empathy towards others is part of what we call ethical living, which is what Eleanor Roosevelt championed, particularly in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah, and we're in a very interesting moment in our country where we're debating basically our role, the United States' role in promoting human rights around the world. What is our position? What should our role be? And it's an interesting debate. Obviously, you have those who believe strongly that America should try to reach out beyond our borders to promote universal values, freedom, democracy, participation, the four freedoms that FDR talked about from want and war. And then there are those who believe at this moment that it's not our job to lecture other people, that we in fact take on too much when we try to insert ourselves into societies that we don't understand, and that we shouldn't Americanize the world. And it's a healthy and real debate, and it's an important debate. Sometimes that leads to, I think, sort of a more isolationist view of things, which seemed to be the strain we've seen in the last few years, partly a reaction to what happened in the Middle East, that there was an exhaustion with the idea that we were in the Middle East trying to make Iraq a democracy. Maybe they don't want to be a democracy. George W. Bush always said that freedom and democracy are universal ideals, and they're not just the province of the United States, and that he dismissed those who said, well, societies aren't conducive to democracy, the same way that we discovered after World War II when people said Germany and Japan were not conducive to democracy. In fact, they now have two of the most robust democracies in our world. Having said that, I think there's a sense that, that can be, not our role in the world to be the policeman of the world. And I think this tug of war between those two ideals is very front and center right now. Biden and Trump, if they had a real campaign in the fall, that probably would have been one of the central divisions between them. I think now it's kind of been transformed by this virus. But even there, I think, we're seeing now the virus being used as an excuse by governments in some places to clamp down, to impose restrictions and consolidate power in a way that goes beyond simply public health. Eastern Europe in particular, other places as well. And I think that when we get through this pandemic, what will be an important debate to have is, where does the world go from here? Have we made a lasting, sustained retrenchment toward more authoritarian governments around the world, or will there be a reaction by people to say, no, that's not something we're going to do?
Right. So the last question, her last chapter is titled "The Land is Bright." Then as now, with population growth exploding, the straining of resources and climate change, Eleanor remained convinced that the future was bright and that it belongs to those believing in the beauty of their dreams. That's one of her famous quotes. She emphasized the two main pillars of preparation today for the future of tomorrow: good education for all, and the essential need of sparkling a new, deep, and fervent sense of responsibility in every individual. Could you make a last comment on her sense that we are all together in this, and together we will deliver the future tomorrow we all want? And talk to students about this aspect of life right now.
That's a great question.
Eternal optimist.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that was so appealing about her to so many people, was that she did in fact look forward to a brighter tomorrow, and she spent her life, she devoted her life toward making it happen as best she could. And I think that there are so many people out there today who are following in that same vein. And I don't mean just people on the left or the liberal side. I think there are people on the right and the conservative side as well, who believe that they are trying in their best way to make this a better country and a better world. They may disagree about the way to get there, but they have devoted their lives to it. And I'm an optimist. I really am. I think you guys have such a remarkable life ahead of you, in which we will continue to struggle, obviously, with challenges like the one we're going through now. We will obviously have our debates and through these polarized times. That tribalism is one of your big challenges that your generation is gonna confront. But broadly speaking, I think that the life ahead is going to be better. And I think it's because your generation is going to come along with new energy and new idealism and new spirit, and help us solve some of these problems. And even though we're going to have other problems come along, bring us to a better place. We are in such a better place today than we were 50 years ago. And we were in a better place then than we were 50 years before that. Just imagine what you can do today. Now, you're not going to be able to get on a plane tomorrow. It may be a year or so before we're flying again, but you can go anywhere in the world, and you can explore places and meet people and learn things, and maybe even help out, maybe join an organization that is helping other countries develop and change their countries for the better. And I just think there's so many possibilities ahead, and I'm a huge believer in the future. And in large part, is because I see young people every day in my organization and others who have the energy and spirit and drive that will bring all of us ahead. And so I'm not a public speaker. I'm not inspirational in the way that Eleanor Roosevelt was, but I do believe in the theme she's talking about there in that last chapter, that our better days are still ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, we would like to open the session for many questions that are coming in. for you. So the first question is, what is the most surprising part of covering the current White House? And maybe we should explain that this is not your first White House, that you've covered 3 other previous White Houses. And so what is the most surprising part of covering the current White House?
Right. I didn't give any bio, but I've been covering the White House more or less since 1996. I came in during Bill Clinton's re-election campaign, and other than 4 years abroad, I've been ever since. So I covered Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and now Donald Trump. And in fact, Manuela was very kind enough to work with me on what turned out to be, I think, a lovely coffee table photo book of the Obama presidency, which we also then made into a book that's sort of a regular text-oriented book, and I think that
great book.
I think it's still available. Anybody wants to get it.
Great book. Obama: The Call of History.
Obama: The Call of History, by Callaway and the New York Times, in conjunction together. This is a very different president, and it's a different presidency. After covering Clinton and Bush and Obama, I had begun to think that the presidency and the presidents were more alike than not. I mean, obviously they have come from different parties and ideologies. One wants to do this and the other wants to do that. Personality-wise, there are some differences there, but they broadly were within a certain defined American consensus about our problems and the range of solutions to think about considering, the norms that we had established and how to abide by them. And then we have President Trump come in, and he doesn't come from that mold. He is an outsider in every sense. Remember, he is the first of our presidents. Out of 45 presidents, he is the only one who never served a single day in either government or the military before becoming president. He had no experience with public service in that sense. And he has been a disruptor. That is his goal. He wants to disrupt. And we can say that's good or bad. That depends on your perspective. Sometimes shaking things up is a good thing. But it also means that he has dispensed with some of the norms and practices that we have come to rely on in terms of governing our institutions. He's been willing to do things that other presidents would never have done. So in the past, if you had said to me, this president has this problem, I would have been able to say to you, okay, here are some things he and eventually she might consider doing. And here are things that absolutely would never happen. This would just never happen. No president would ever do this. That phrase doesn't apply with this president. The phrase "no president would ever" does not apply with President Trump. He surprises us every day, even though we probably shouldn't be surprised. And again, I'm not putting a value on that. Some people will think that's good. I think people who come to these rallies, and I cover them, they're full of energy, they're full of spirit. They want him to get out there and break the China. They don't like Washington. They think that Washington is corrupt and messed up and for the elites. And they think that he's getting in there. And the fact that they don't like him in Washington is a sign that he must be doing something right. On the flip side, of course, are those people, and they include Republicans and Democrats, who think that he has completely shattered the norms that we set up, particularly after Watergate, that were useful, that created checks and balances, that the president wasn't using the government for his own purposes, and that in fact that President Trump is not in fact a cleaner up of the swamp, but somebody who has created his own swamp. So it's a real different presidency in that sense, and it's much more outside of the norms than we've ever seen before. As a reporter covering it, it's more exciting because you're always guaranteed a story. He's going to say or do something that nobody else would have done before, and from a reporter's point of view, that means you're going to get a good story. It's also been a more hostile environment than reporters have seen. Other presidents didn't like us either. No president likes the press because he almost always, and she eventually again will always be covered critically. That's the nature of our job. We are an adversarial press, an independent institution. But this president has made it more of an open war. His fake press, his fake news slurs, and particularly enemies of the people, phrases that were used by Stalin to justify the massacre of people. That's dangerous rhetoric. And it goes beyond simple media criticism, which I think is perfectly fair. So that creates a different environment as well. So those are things that are a little taste of what's different.
Right. So the next question is, you attend the daily briefings, or when they were going on, how do you see public health officials managing behind the scenes?
Yeah.
What was your observation of?
It's a great question. I think the public health officials have tried to walk a fine line between being true to their science, true to their craft, as honest as they feel they can be, and yet not do or say things that contradict the president in such an overt way that they will lose his confidence, anger him, and get themselves pushed out. And it's not because they want to be in the limelight, but it's because it's important to have people of science in the room when these decisions are made. They're not going to win every fight, but if they're in the room, their input is part of the equation at least. So I think you watch Deborah Birx, and you watch Tony Fauci, and you watch Robert Redfield, and they're trying to not anger a volatile president who is easily angered without compromising, the truth of their scientific judgment. And that's a really hard balance to find, I think.
Right.
We've seen this president throw people out for much less. Anybody who speaks out in a way he doesn't like, he's willing to toss them aside. So it's a challenge for anybody, I think.
Right. This is a journalistic question. How much fact checking do you find yourself needing to do after a briefing?
A lot. It's a lot of these briefings are fact-free environments, and it's our job to help readers and our viewers sort through what's true, what's not, what's exaggerated, what's distorted, and what's real. And it's not an easy task. I mean, again, every president, every politician will stretch the truth and sometimes even lie in order to serve their purposes. But we've never seen a president who is as profligate in putting out things that are not true as this one. My colleagues and friends over at the Washington Post have tabulated, I've forgotten the latest number, but it's something like 16,000 false or misleading statements that they have checked by this president since he took office. And just think about the extent of that. I said at a briefing, if the president is talking, and he says something, I don't accept that it's true at face value. Everything he says, I will double check before assuming that it is true, because he has been so willing not only to say things that he might just get wrong, because we all get things wrong from time to time, but to repeat things he's been told are wrong. And that's, I think, a very different trend than we've seen. I've never seen other presidents do that. I've seen other presidents, again, stretch the truth, maybe even say things that are false, but usually they didn't want to get caught. And if they got caught, they definitely would then, back off. This president will continue to say things that are not true, no matter how many times he's been told they're not true.
Right. What role do you think the pandemic will have on the election?
I think the pandemic is the election now. I think that everything that came before is overshadowed by this, almost existential crisis that we're facing. And so the president's handling of it will be front and center. It will be issue number one, the economy and the health crisis. These two big, sort of twin crises together are all rolled into one. And we'll see what happens in the fall. If things look better, if the curve has flattened and we're beginning to reopen and people feel like the worst is behind them and there's some trajectory upwards for the economy again, that could benefit the president. If, on the other hand, we're having a second wave of the disease because we reopened too quickly, or if the economy is more sluggish than he thinks it's going to be, that obviously works against him. It's not. There's no history of a president having what's happened and then winning a re-election. He is, on paper, he should not. He is an underdog by any measure. He is at 43 or 44% in most of the approval ratings. He has never actually had an approval rating for a single day of his presidency that included a majority of the people of 51%, not one day. That's never been true in the history of American presidents and polling. So he has always been governing with a minority share of the people. The question has been whether he can pull an inside straight the way he did last time by hitting the right states in the Electoral College. And that's an open question. Right now, Joe Biden is up somewhat in most of these battleground states, but so is Hillary Clinton. And I think that we just don't know, and it's still too soon to say how it will play out. It depends on how Biden does in the debates. It depends on the economy, and it depends on where we are in terms of our health.
Right. So this is a related question. Speaking of conspiracy theories, many are concerned about the impacts of the pandemic holding up the election completely. What are you hearing in Washington?
Well, some of the states, as you probably know, have either delayed or, in the case of New York, even canceled primary elections. And so it's a natural question then to ask, what about November? The difference between those, though, is that the Constitution has the election in November, and there's no means in it for changing that. There's no constitutional provision for suspending the election or moving the date. Now, remember, we have had elections throughout our history, no matter what crisis we were going through. We had it during the Civil War. FDR had it during World War II. We had it, through Vietnam and through 9/11. I mean, we have never, ever delayed a November general election for presidency as a result of crisis. Now, it may mean that we have to do things differently. And this is where you get into this mail-in voting controversy. Again, the idea that mail-in voting becomes a partisan issue is rather telling about where our country is right now in terms of your question, Manuela, about being individual. You would think mail-in voting ought to be something that people all can agree on one way or the other, because why would it be a pro this or an anti that? It's just a method. It's not but in fact, it has become already a very partisan issue. And so we'll see how far states go toward allowing more of that and how that will affect turnout. That's the big question in the fall, is who actually comes to vote. I think the American people decided a long time ago what they think of President Trump, either like him or not like him. His number has stayed the same through 3.5 years of his presidency. We have never seen that either, by the way. We have never seen a president's approval rating stay so static within a narrow band for his entire presidency. That's just not the case. Almost all presidents go up and go down depending on events, right? After 9/11, George W. Bush went way up. After the killing of bin Laden, Obama went way up, but both of them then went down. So we have not seen that. People decided a long time ago what they think of Donald Trump, and they have not changed their mind, which is why turnout matters more than anything. Can Joe Biden animate younger voters, and particularly liberals, who are not necessarily as excited about him as they were about Bernie Sanders, and get them to come out in a way they didn't come out 4 years ago? Can he keep the African-American community energized? Can he win over suburban women with a vice presidential pick that he says now will be a woman? These are big questions, I think.
This is an Eleanor question. Do you think the pandemic is making the world more empathetic or apathetic?
I would like to think the former. I see a lot of the latter. We haven't even gotten to the worst of what this pandemic is going to be globally. It has not yet gotten to Africa and Latin America and Gaza and places like that, in parts of Asia, where it will take a toll so much worse than it has here. Places without the infrastructure, without the medical care, without the resources and wealth. That's right. And I worry that we have only scratched the surface, and that we are going to be in for a much, much worse time. I look at Gaza. I was based briefly in the Middle East. Gaza basically is 2 million people living in a tiny, tiny strip of land, blockaded basically by Egypt on one side and Israel on the other. They cannot get out. It is a cloistered environment. They have almost no work, no resources, no infrastructure. The medical care there is awful. If and when the virus were to get into Gaza, it would ravish that place. And I can think of a lot of other places like that. So what worries me is, at this point, is our empathy has not yet really caught up with the challenge that we're about to face in a global way.
Right. This is an interesting question. How has your work changed in light of the pandemic?
Well, I'm doing a lot more of this, a lot more Zoom talks, and a lot more video than I ever did. I've been working from home now since March 11th. Our newsroom is closed, has been closed since then. Our editor-in-chief just today, as a matter of fact, they put out a note saying they do not plan to reopen until September 8th, after Labor Day at the earliest, even assuming that it's okay then. So that means we're going to go through the summer working from home. The White House Correspondents Association has limited the number of reporters that we want in the briefing room every day at this point. We're taking turns so that we don't have too many. We can keep more socially distant. We at the New York Times have chosen basically not to go to the White House during the stay-at-home orders. We're working remotely from home by phone and by video and all that. I went one day last month when it was our pool day. A pool is when we have a select few reporters who are responsible for covering events for everybody else, because they can't all get into the Oval Office, or they can't all travel on Air Force One. And so we take turns being in the pool. When it was our pool day, I went to the White House for that because we had a responsibility to other news organizations. But beyond that, other than that day, for the most part, we have not been there in a month and a half. And I think that it's possible to report this way. It's not ideal. It's always better to see people in person, to go have coffee with sources, to meet people for lunch, to be able to run into people in the halls and ask them and pass along gossip and all of that kind of thing. As a reporter's craft, it is very stultifying to be at home and you're not going to get as much information. But we're just doing the best we can like everybody else.
Very good. Another question you mentioned is bottom-up organizing. Widespread systematic gaps are even more fully exposed. How can we push the levers of government to address some of the long-standing inequalities that American society has been built on?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think this pandemic has brought into stark relief some of the problems that have been underlying for a long time anyway, and simply not paid attention to, right? The fact that here in Washington, D.C., 79% of the death toll from the virus has been African-American raises very serious questions, and it's similar numbers in all places, a lot of places around the country. Washington, D.C. is not 79% African-American. So why is it so much more disproportionate among that community? What does that tell us about healthcare? What does it tell us about employment practices? What does it tell us that we're going to try to send our meat packers back to work, but our lawyers are going to still work at home? You know, these are big, profound questions. And I think that you're right, that the pandemic is bringing them to the fore. Now, what to do about that, I'm not a solutions guy, I'm a problems guy. That's what journalists are. We identify the problems, and it's up to the society that, you know, that reads our material to find the solution. So I'm not sure exactly what to tell you about how to solve them, but I think awareness is the first step. Unless people are paying attention to them, there's no solution possible. And I think that one of the things that this has done is bring to the fore a lot of these issues that had been neglected or undercovered before.
Right. What stories do you think aren't getting enough airtime that you recommend we pay attention to?
Well, I mean, right now, this is it. It's sucking all the oxygen out of the room in terms of the news. There are so many things that are happening around the world that we're not really able to pay full attention to because this is the be all and end all. One thing we talked a little bit about earlier is in my view, is the the impact on democracy and freedoms around the world. And you know, again, it's a fine line between a reasonable public health response that is going to limit your freedoms during a temporary period of time, and an authoritarian government that's going to take advantage of that and permanently make changes in terms of holding on to power and cramping open societies, to use the phrase. Look at what's happening with Vladimir Putin. Even as we're talking about this, he is in the process of changing the constitution in Russia in order to hold on to office basically for the rest of his life. That kind of thing is probably happening in so many places around the world, and it's not front page, even though we try to put it as much as we can on the front page, certainly not on the evening news as much as it could be, because we're all consumed, understandably, by this existential crisis.
Right. I think this last question you answered, what kind of testing is available for those covering the White House, but you said you're not going physically.
We have, what they do for reporters who do go is they give you a temperature test before you go in the White House grounds. They won't let you on unless you test normal. And then before a briefing starts, they'll do another temperature test and they'll put a sticker on you to show that you've been tested. One day, about 3 weeks ago, they gave everybody one of those rapid COVID-19 tests. So everybody who was going to be in the room with the president actually tested negative for coronavirus that particular day, because one of our colleagues had turned out sick and we were worried that meant she had the coronavirus and might have infected others. I think in the end turned out to be negative. So it turned out to be a false alarm, fortunately. Now the president and the vice president get tested once a week for COVID-19, which is a good thing. And supposedly, I think a lot of their aides are getting tested pretty regularly as well, because you don't want anybody near the president who could be sick. Obviously, it's important that our president, whoever he is, whether you support him or not, be protected from that, because that's the leadership of our country.
We have the last 5 minutes and 2 questions. How do you see leadership after being witness to it over all these years?
That's a great question. It's a really good question. Leadership, you could write books about that. In fact, people, of course, have. I just finished reading Doris Kearns Goodwin's book that came out last year or maybe 2 years ago called Leadership. And it was a study of exactly, a study of 4 presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson. She, of course, has written separate books about all 4, and she looked at the things that made them leaders. She looked at the traits that brought them to power to begin with, and how they used that power when they had it. And there are some consistencies there. I would recommend the book, but a lot of lessons of leadership. One of them is bringing people together, building consensus, getting people to buy in. I think about, for instance, we've got a book coming out. My wife and I have a book coming out this fall, and it's a biography of James Baker, who was Secretary of State under George H.W. Bush and White House Chief of Staff under Ronald Reagan. And I think he was a model in terms of leadership, in terms of bringing people together, getting buy-in on policies that were important. He was a tough campaign operative who savaged Michael Dukakis in the 1988 campaign, and Al Gore when he ran the recount in 2000. I mean, he was no softy. But for him, when the even year election was over, in the odd year, he turned around and worked with the opposition to create consensus policies to make the country better, right? He helped, overhauled Social Security in 1983, the last time that was done on a bipartisan basis, by working with Tip O'Neill, who was the Democratic Speaker of the House. He rewrote the whole tax code in 1987 by working with Dan Rostenkowski, who was the Democratic chairman of the Right Committee in the House. He solved the Contra wars. The Contras were the rebels in Nicaragua who'd been sponsored by the Reagan administration to fight a communist leadership. And that had torn America apart for a decade. James Baker sat down with Jimmy Carter and Jim Wright, 2 big Democrats, and found a way to move on past that. So leadership is not just about winning elections. That's part of it. You have to be competitive. It is about competition, but it's also about finding solutions once the competition is over. And I think what we lack these days, and it's not just this presidency, what we lack these days is that interregnum between elections, when it's okay to work together to find solutions. These days, unfortunately, in Washington, the word compromise is seen as a sin rather than a virtue. It used to be, when I started covering it, people would want to get a member of Congress would want to get somebody from the other party to join them sponsoring a bill, whatever it was. So I'd get a Democrat if I were a Republican, or if I get a Republican if I were a Democrat. We would sign on together and it would look good. Today, they pay a price. They pay a penalty, because that means the far left or the far right or whoever will see them as being insufficiently committed to the cause if you're working with somebody from the other side. And that, unfortunately, then means it's the prescription for stalemate and gridlock. And you may not like the results of compromise, because compromise is not very satisfying at times. It's not everything you might want to see happen, but it is the way things get done. And Doris Kearns Goodwin's book does a good job of showing how FDR, LBJ, 2 very liberal Democrats, as well as Teddy Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln, 2 Republicans, demonstrated that leadership when they were in charge of the country.
Right. Last question of all. Do you have any advice to young journalists who are starting out in journalism and are experiencing difficulties with connecting to sources?
Yeah, just never take no for an answer. Just be persistent, not obnoxious. I understand some people think reporters are obnoxious, and that's a way. I don't say the reporter should be obnoxious, but I do think they should be persistent. Everybody who says no, there's somebody out there who's going to say yes. And the people who say no, if you go back to them again, and you might find that you wear them down in a polite way. Look, it's a job where people are going to slam doors in your face. That's if you're a good reporter, they're going to slam doors in your face, and that means you're not going to stop just because they do. If you haven't watched the best movie on journalism, of course, is All the President's Men, about Woodward and Bernstein during Watergate. And you'll see there that they go night after night to the homes of these people who worked for the president's reelection committee, and one after the other, door slam, door slam, door slam. Finally, somebody lets them in, and they work with that person. They get them to trust them, and they get information that's necessary to break the story. So in journalism, persistence is a key. You cannot ever take no for an answer. You have to recognize that you're not always going to be the most popular person that people see when they open the door, but it's your job to keep going back and calling again and again, and never give up, basically.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you for being with us for this last hour. I want to turn it now to Erin, because she wants to remind students about this wonderful grant opportunity for the Student Engagement Award.
Thank you so much. It was fascinating, Peter, and I'm glad that you're not having to go too much into the White House with all that exposure. I was wondering about when I see the briefings and I see the photographers, and I'm wondering how they keep it everyone safe. So I'm glad that there are good protocols in place for everybody, and it's been fascinating. In another life, I might have been a journalist. So I always like to watch from the sidelines and imagine what it must be like. So I very much appreciate it. I did want to remind people about the Student Engagement Award, which is an OSUN and Telwar Network collaboration. And links for it can be found at the Telwar or BARD Center for Civic Engagement website. And this is for students who are working on community engagement projects that have had to pivot in the time of COVID. Award winners will be announced in June, and then the funds will go towards students' projects, and they will also, student awardees will be able to participate in some of our conferences and conversations. The next panel that we're going to be having will be on public health and biodiversity, and that's with a number of faculty from across the world. And that's going to be this Monday, May 11th at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So please join us if you can. All of our events are going to be recorded in the case that you're not able to join us. And I think it's very important for us across a number of cultural and educational organizations to connect and have conversation. Sometimes it's hard for us to connect because we're busy. And one of the things that I found fascinating about this time is that sometimes it's easier to actually link across sectors in a way that will be important for us going forward. And so I appreciate the time and energy that you put in, Peter, and good luck to Susan. And we hope to see her here. And we'll keep the conversation going and take much of what you've said in mind and put that to good use as we move forward.
Thank you, guys. This is wonderful. I love the questions. It was a lot of fun, and I'm really excited about your program, and I wish you the best of luck as you continue to go forward with it.
Thank you so much, Peter. You are indeed fascinating, and we will follow you in print and in TV and in your forthcoming book with Susan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank everybody who participated. It was very good.
I do want to put a shout out to all of the tech people who are invisible to everyone else. So I do want to put a shout out to Lauren Cook and Jacob Grover for helping us. And Lauren actually is a BARD alum who is now, who's working on international work with students and has had to pivot herself in some of her own learning in order to reach an international audience these days. So I just want to send that out too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, BARD team, for making this possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.